Hey guys, welcome back. Doing a watch through with you in reaction to Andre Jinks, why 140,000 is the new poor. I assume he's talking about California or other, big metropolitan cities, but let's see what he's got to say and yeah, go from there.
So there was this blog post that went crazy viral, and it talked about what it means to be poor in America. And the author of that post, Michael Green, said that the real poverty line is not $31,000 like the government's telling you. Instead, it's actually closer to $140,000 a
Facts.
year.
The entire point for me was not to actually dig in and define a new poverty line.
I mean, if you're a household of 100,000 and you only have two people in there, I mean, cost of living is eating up majority of it on top of rent. So, yeah, I mean, it just kind of breaks down to how situated you are with your needs being met first.
It was to understand what the average American household was experiencing. I built those numbers up from the MIT living wage components.
Now, this obviously got a lot of attention and a lot of
Can't
debate.
imagine why.
So in today's video, I want to share with you what that post said and give you my personal thoughts. So let me just start right here. The question is, what does it mean to be poor in America? In the 1960s, the government
Means you can't really do jack shit because you don't have the money to pay for things or do things or, when you go to places, right? Walking around money.
asked Molly Orshansky to go and find out the answer to that question. What is poverty? Which, if you think about, is really hard to define because one person's definition might be really different than someone else's. But here's how the government defined it. They started by assuming a couple of things. Number one, they assumed it was a family of four. Secondly, that food was the biggest and most predictable part of their budget, and that if you knew the bare minimum cost of feeding that family, you could just sort of work backwards to estimate everything else.
What did you
Because
say?
food was consistently the biggest part of a family's budget back in the 1960s. But fast forward to today, and we spend proportionally way less money on food and way, way more on everything else, like housing and healthcare and childcare, transportation, insurance, debt, taxes, and all those other things. And those categories did not get factored in to the original formula. And what that has done is it has created the illusion that poverty has barely grown. But Michael Green says, if we apply the same original method and the same logic, except we use the share of income Americans spend on essentials today, we would not get a poverty line of $31,000. Instead, it would be closer to $140,000.
The simple reality is, in a world in which, in order
I mean, just to give you an example, 30,000 is like 15 bucks an hour. So, yeah, I mean, what can you do with 15 bucks an hour?
to afford to rent or buy a home, you need a second income. Childcare becomes a very real component of it. We're actually seeing more and more households who are incapable of clearing that threshold for participation in the modern economy. The last 50 years has seen an extraordinary tax cut for the wealthiest Americans and an extraordinary tax hike for those in kind of the 20th to 80th percentile. Ignoring that is really at the core of the issue.
And that would mean millions of people who consider themselves to be middle class by the original definition and the original logic of the government are instead actually living in the modern day equivalent of poverty. And that's just crazy. So in this video,
Gotta keep
I
the
want to
dream
help explain
alive.
how the article is arguing this and give you my thoughts. I think this is a super interesting story. So with that said, let's get into it. Hi, my name is Andre Jick. Hope you're doing well. Come for the finance and stay for the poverty line. Now, regardless of what you think about the actual number, it sparked a conversation. So full credit to Michael Green for sharing this. I'm going to leave the article down below because it goes into way more interesting detail. Now, let me just sort of set the stage for how, when the poverty line was first created, it made sense for the world of that time. Why? Because it was a time when one person's income could support a family of four. And childcare costs weren't a thing because one
Al
parent
Bundy.
stayed at home. and insurance costs were usually covered by their job. Incomes also kind of grew with inflation, and housing cost a fraction of what it does today. But instead of updating the formula as the economy changed, the government just sort of froze it in time. They never changed the core assumptions of what it meant to be poor once they defined it the way they did. They never added more categories like housing and healthcare. They did not want to adjust those spending ratios. Instead, what they did was they just adjusted the original number, which was roughly $3,000. And with inflation, every year they were like, let's just pump it up. Okay, that looks good enough.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why, if you ask the government today, what does it mean to be poor at the poverty line?
They won't even tell you.
They would tell you that number is about $31,000 a year. And because of that, this 1960s formula is what became the foundation for almost every major government policy around things like welfare and assistance programs and food stamps and school lunches, and even how we measure the success or the failure of the economy. And this is where the problem gets even crazier. Every major spending category that is our life today has completely flipped since the 1960s. Again, back then, food was the biggest household expense, and housing was pretty cheap. Today, food is one of our smallest expenses, and housing is the single biggest burden on most families. On top of that, healthcare costs have exploded. Childcare has become a full-time salary. Paying for insurance is now a mandatory thing. Everyone has to do it. Student debt has gotten out of control. And on top of all that, we have to pay more in taxes today than ever before.
Facts.
And none of this really exists.
We don't talk about who changed said tax codes, but okay.
Existed in the original formula. Okay then, if all of that is true, then isn't that obvious? Why wouldn't the government update the old formula then, right? Well, it turns out they tried to, a lot of times. They tried to in the 70s, in the 80s, the 90s, and even the early 2000s. Economists called the poverty line inaccurate and outdated. But changing the formula turned out to be politically toxic.
Shocker.
Because if you update the poverty line to
then everybody
represent
realizes
reality,
they're broke.
that would then mean millions of more people would suddenly become poor on paper overnight.
And
if
kill the
that
economy.
were to happen, guess what the government would have to do? The government would be obligated to pay more assistance, spend more money, and acknowledge a very big economic crisis. And who wants to do that,
the dollar
right?
is deflationary.
And that brings us to the next question.
Inflationary.
If
Inflation.
the old formula is broken, what would the poverty line be if we recalculated it using the same formula but with today's spending? Now, before I show you the map on that,
I'm going
I
to guess
think today's
140.
you know,
Let's see.
what's growing is they represent
God
basic
damn, Andre.
The multiplier does not stay at 3. It becomes 16. Wait, what? How, right?
Huh?
It's completely counterintuitive because most people think, okay, if food is 6% of my budget, I've got a lot left over.
No.
But that does not mean you have 94% left over for everything else. What it actually means is that everything, housing,
Everything
healthcare,
went up, and your
childcare,
dollars went
transportation,
less.
all those other things have exploded relative to food. Food got smaller because the other essentials got bigger. That's why the ratio has to jump. So for example, let's say you spend $10,000 a year on food, and food happens to be 10% of your yearly budget.
Yeah, okay.
So 10% compared to everything else you spend money on.
About $800 or so a month.
Multiplied
Yeah,
by 10
sounds-
gets us to 100, your full budget. Make sense? That's why the multiplier is 10. Okay, so $10,000 multiplied by 10 gets us to $100,000. That's what this person has to make more than to be considered above the poverty line, according to Michael Green. Because relative to food, everything else would be more expensive. Okay, Andre, none of this makes sense to me. Try again.
Nope,
Right,
yeah.
so here's another example.
Dumb it down.
Let's instead substitute food with another
Bananas.
essential thing that is closer to what the 60s looked like. Now, food was a third back then. Now it's not. What takes up a third for us nowadays, for most people? Rent, right? Their mortgage.
It's more than 30%.
In some cases, more than a third, but let's just use a third. So we know the multiplier, just like the 60s, is going to stay the same. It's going to be multiplied by 3. Okay, so let's say you pay the national average of $2,000 a month for your rent. That's $24,000 a year. Multiplied by 3, that would get us $72,000 a year to be above the poverty line. Michael Green argues, if you don't make more than that, and you pay that much for rent, that means you probably don't have much left over for everything else. Especially not much left over if you want to invest. That right there is the easiest way to say the government is wrong about $31,000 because today's poverty is much higher based on another essential thing that is today that is relative to the ratio of another thing back in the day. That's method number 1. Now, method number 2 uses the modern update that Michael Green, which is, I think, even easier. And instead of relying on ratios, what you're doing is you're going to add up the actual cost of the things families cannot avoid paying for today. Because, unlike the 60s, you don't just pay for rent. You also have to pay for childcare, which they didn't have to do on one income. You also need transportation and food, healthcare, which at that time was taken care of by their employers. And once you add up conservative national average numbers for those categories, the way that Michael Green does this, you do not get $75,000. You end up needing a net income of around $118,000 just to cover the basics for a family of 4. After you add in roughly $18,500 in federal, state, and FICA taxes, that brings you to a required gross income of around $136,500 a year. That is the modern-day version of Molly Orshansky's too little threshold, the minimum needed to keep a family of 4 afloat in 2024. So, to put this into perspective, the household median in the U.S. today is about $80,000 a year. That's with 2 earners. But the moment both parents have to go to work, they trigger the $32,000 childcare bill because somebody has to
take care of the kid. Yep.
The second worker then is not working to get ahead. They're working to pay the person watching their kids so that they can go to work. I think that might explain why so many young people are choosing not to have kids today. I can already see what some of the comments are going to say.
Dink.
Well, I don't make $140,000 a year and I do just fine. And yes, obviously, there's a lot of people that don't make $140,000 a year and still make it work.
And your location is
$140,000 number.
Your location is definitely part of that equation.
It's not supposed to be luxury living. We're not factoring in, iPhones and vacations and Starbucks. The calculation includes 3 things: modest housing, basic health care, and bare minimum child care if both parents work. That's it. There's no luxuries, there's no extras. Now, the second comment I can see people say is, well, not everyone wants to have kids. And that's true. But the original poverty formula was not created for singles. It was created for a household. In the 1960s, every poverty threshold assumed a family structure. And childcare back then was covered by a parent that stayed at home because they did not need a second income. Today, that role costs anywhere between $10,000 to $15,000 a year, conservatively. So if we're sticking to the original logic, childcare has to be included, which is also probably why people are choosing to have kids a lot later than ever before. Now, the third thing I can see people say is, well, just move somewhere cheaper.
If you're a young person and you can't afford to live here, then maybe you should not live here. I mean, that is a real thing. I know that we've now grown up in a society that says that you deserve to live where you grew up, but the reality is that the history of America is almost literally the opposite of that. The history of America is you go to a place where there is opportunity.
Now, here's reality.
Yeah, I mean, that's coming from a multimillionaire who would tell you if you can't afford your coastal home, you should go ahead and move and let someone buy it who can afford it, being him.
Even the cheapest states in the country now have a housing to income ratio that is historically very high. There's a national shortage of affordable housing. So moving across the country is not going to magically fix the whole economic system where the price of shelter.
And everyone from the major cities has already moved to those places that were affordable. Your Iowas, your Nebraskas, your Idahos, Montana. And now, with all of that out of state money, the entire market is upside down on what things are actually worth.
Has grown faster than income for decades. Now, another thing I can see people say is, well, healthcare shouldn't be included. That inflates the number. But in the 1960s, healthcare was only about 5% of a family's budget. Today, between premiums and deductibles and out-of-pocket costs, it can take up to 15 to 20% of your income. And it's not an optional thing. You have to have healthcare. If the original formula included the biggest essential expenses of its time, then the modern calculation has to do the same. Another thing people might say is, the $140,000 number is inflated by big coastal cities. But this calculation actually uses national medians, not New York or San Francisco.
They all moved.
If you used only major cities like that, the poverty line would be way higher. And maybe the biggest objection I could see is, well, you're just changing the definition to push a specific narrative. But this is literally the government's...
I think we can all agree that the majority of people, over 50% of the US population, is finding it very difficult to survive, let alone thrive.
Original poverty formula that they use today. It's the same logic. It is the same math. The only thing that's changed is the modern reality that I'm plugging into it. If the economy
numbers
evolves, but the formula doesn't, then it doesn't make sense anymore. And obviously the last thing I can see people say is, the article was debunked because the author didn't use realistic numbers. And I think there's some truth to that because it really depends on your assumptions and your costs, which not everyone will agree with, but I think that's sort of missing the bigger point. All right, so if you made it this far, here's what I think. I think the reason that all of this matters is because without understanding how our reality looks in a way that's
Andre, I
accurate,
appreciate
we will never be able to...
you taking care, but yeah, that's just where things are. It's not easy, and it's not gonna be. Life isn't. No one ever said it was gonna be easy. No one likes a quitter. So, I've flown as high with the eagles, and I've been slithering with the snakes at the bottom. I know what it's like to start over, okay? To have something and then watch it all go to nothing and having to pick yourself back up. So it's not easy. It takes time. It takes, putting steps, putting in work, and good things do come, but you got, like I said, put the work in, put the time in. I've been doing recruiting for over 10 years, and it's tough right now. I don't know that a lot of people aren't hiring, or they're waiting to see how the economy goes in the next 3 to 6 months. That's the reality that a lot of people are living with. So just know that there are facts, that your feelings are valid, that this is what